Next, on the Bible Skeptic, in our previous episode, we were introduced to the biblical story of Jonah, the reluctant prophet of Yahweh who found himself swallowed by a great fish. In this episode, we will examine Christian apologetic attempts to identify this great fish and whether or not a human being really could live in the belly of an enormous sea creature for an extended amount of time, just as described in the Book of Jonah. Funding for this program was provided in part by the generous contributions of viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you. If we are to take the tale of Jonah seriously, as a record of historical events, as the evangelical apologists insist we do, the first major question we should be asking is what swallowed Jonah? If it were a great fish, some sort of sea creature, what sort of animal could have swallowed a man whole? Does there, or did there exist, an animal in the sea somewhere between Palestine and Spain that had a mouth large enough to take in the body of a man? Evangelicals insisting on a literal interpretation of the story of Jonah are not short on potential candidates. Dr. John Morris, president of the Institute for Creation Research, a Christian apologetic ministry which advocates for a literal interpretation of the Bible and, as a consequence, belief in an earth that is between 6,000 to 10,000 years old, has argued, there are several species of whale and of sharks alive today with gullets large enough to swallow a man whole. Among extinct animals, like the plesiosaurs, the same could be said, and perhaps this was a heretofore unknown fish of large size. Creationists like Dr. Morris believe dinosaurs and human beings lived together in the not-too-distant past. Their view on the age of the earth does not allow dinosaurs to have existed tens of millions of years before human beings evolved. So it is not out of the question for them that Jonah may have been swallowed by what modern science has deemed an extinct creature. Staying close to modern candidates, however, Don Landis, pastor of Community Bible Church in Jackson, Wyoming, and author of an article on Jonah published by the creationist organization Answers in Genesis, writes, "Any aquatic creature could be referred to as a fish, and we know that there are whales, blue and sperm, and even sharks, great white and whale sharks, that can swallow a man whole. The sperm whale grows to a length of up to 70 feet. Its esophagus is approximately 50 centimeters wide, and sperm whales don't have to chew their food, so Jonah could have been swallowed whole. Two marine scientists from SeaWorld in San Diego hypothesize that it was a great white shark that probably swallowed Jonah." So for the evangelist and Christian apologist, any number of possible creatures exist which could have swallowed Jonah. The question now is how likely was this to have happened by any of these proposed animals? And now that a handful of candidates exist for the creature which may have swallowed Jonah, we should examine if any of these would likely have actually done so, and once in the belly of the beast, how Jonah survived there for 3 days and nights. The first animal we should consider is the traditional suspect depicted in many religious works of art on the topic, the whale. While many species of whale have a mouth large enough to engulf a man, the problem comes at the whale's esophagus. The average width of the human male is 1 foot 6 inches, or about 50 centimeters, and most whales do not have the esophageal diameter wide enough through which a man could fit. There does exist a species of whale, the sperm, with an esophagus of roughly the appropriate size, so it is at least not completely out of the question for a slider-belt Jonah to have slipped through the mouth of such a whale and down a very, very tight squeeze into the animal's stomach. If the contractions of the esophageal muscles forcing Jonah down into the whale's digestive system didn't suffocate him, a far worse fate awaited the reluctant prophet once he reached the first of 2 stomachs in the sperm whale, the forestomach. The forestomach is quite large and can hold up to a ton of krill. Poor Jonah, if he had survived the journey down to the crushing esophagus, could have fit nicely in here. However, while the forestomach does not produce any gastric juices, it has a very strong muscular wall, which contracts to crush the whale's food, along with Jonah, had he been swallowed by such an animal. If by some luck he had managed to live through the narrow, contracting passage of the esophagus and survive the crushing environment of the forestomach, Jonah would have then passed to the second stomach. Whales, being mammals, have extremely acidic gastric juices, which finish breaking down their food in this second stomach, to be passed into their intestines. Had Jonah made it this far, there was no chance of survival. The likelihood of Jonah having been consumed by a sperm whale and lived to tell about it is highly improbable, to say the very least. Next, apologists have suggested the great white shark as a candidate for gulping down Jonah. But while apologists like to demonstrate that a man could fit through the gaping mouth of a great white, they never quite detail the feeding behavior of this animal. Great whites don't simply gulp down their food the way a whale does. While Jonah may have been swallowed whole by a whale, a great white would have ripped him to pieces first, even if his entire person eventually wound up in the shark's belly. It has been observed and documented by marine biologists that great whites initially seize their prey and then release it intact. Some have suggested that this seize and release behavior may be to allow the prey to bleed to death before consumption, while others believe the prey is let go in response to the prey's defense behavior, or if the shark deems the animal unsuitable as food. There is evidence to suggest that the great white decides a prey's palpability while it is lodged in its mouth. Researchers also believe that great whites may prefer animals rich in energy, such as marine mammals, in favor of less fatty, energy-poor prey, like the average human being. For these reasons, while great whites are known to attack humans, probably testing them as a suitable food source, they have never been known to eat one. Regardless, Jonah in the belly of a great white would have gone down a Jonah in pieces. Finally, some apologists have suggested prehistoric creatures as possible candidates for the great fish which swallowed Jonah. To consider this possibility, one would need to ignore the scientific evidence that such animals as the mosasaur, which some apologists offer as a potential candidate for Jonah's great fish, went extinct tens of millions of years before Jonah would ever have set foot upon the ship for Spain. Of course, for Christian creationists who maintain a literal interpretation of the Bible and believe in a 6 to 10,000 year old Earth, this isn't a problem. For them, dinosaurs and human beings lived together in the not-too-distant past. All living creatures which have walked, flew, or swam the earth having been formed on the first 6 days of creation, as recounted in the biblical book of Genesis. For creationists, however, providing evidence that such creatures continued to exist into the time of Jonah is a major hurdle, one they have yet to clear. And then one must consider that, regardless of any creature swallowing Jonah, be it a whale, a shark, or some prehistoric monster, how could Jonah have survived in the digestive system smothered in gastric juices, seawater, and no oxygen for 3 days and nights? Some apologists are quick to note that Jonah didn't necessarily stay in the beast for 3 whole days and 3 whole nights, as the Book of Jonah records. Dr. Morris has suggested that Jonah may have only spent part of that time in the beast's belly, by noting, "The Hebrew idiom 3 days and 3 nights has been clearly shown from both Scripture and other sources to mean a period of time beginning on one day and ending on the day after the one following. It doesn't necessarily mean 3 full days and nights." But frankly, it doesn't matter how long Jonah was in the fish. It could have been part of one day, a full day, and part of the following in keeping with the Hebrew idiom. What is important is the question that still remains. How could a man survive being eaten and landing in something as inhospitable as a monstrous fish's belly for any significant amount of time? Some apologists, in trying to bring credibility to the story of Jonah, have noted other tales of people having been swallowed by sea creatures. Real-life Jonahs have been referenced by various Christian evangelicals. J. Stephen Lang, in his book, Talking Donkeys and Wheels of Fire, Bible Stories That Are Truly Bizarre, recounted one such legend about a man, James Bartley. Lang wrote of Bartley, "In February 1891, he was a crew member on the whaling ship Star of the East, which was in the waters off the Falkland Islands near South America. Bartley was one of several men let down in the longboats sent to pursue a sperm whale. One of the men harpooned the whale, which submerged itself, then suddenly surfaced, rocketing the men into the air. But after a long struggle, the whale died, surfacing near the ship. The crew hoisted it alongside the ship and began cutting it up into smaller pieces. When the whale's stomach was hauled onto the deck, the crew noticed it was moving slightly. The ship's doctor cut the stomach open, and inside was James Bartley, curled up and unconscious, but still alive. He had been inside the whale for 15 hours. The whale's digestive juices had removed all the hair from the man's body and bleached his skin white. Also, he was nearly blind. This isn't a fiction." Problem is, that's exactly what the James Bartley story is, a fiction. A fiction which for the better part of a century has been handed down among evangelicals as evidence against the skeptics that Jonah really could have been swallowed by a whale, picked up and added to Lang's book of truly bizarre biblical stories. The story of James Bartley is a fiction because the so-called whaling ship, the Star of the East, was no such thing. It was a bark of 733 net tonnage, owned by Sir Roderick Cameron of London. A check on the list of the ship's crew for when she sailed makes no mention of a James Bartley, nor of anyone of similar name, either for the entire voyage or any part of it. Add to this the fact that the British whalers didn't fish off the Falklands in 1891, and what you have is not a whale of a tale helping confirm a modern Jonah, but a fish story cooked up to fool the gullible. Grant Jeffrey, in his apologetic book, Unveiling Mysteries of the Bible, recounts another tale of a man supposedly mimicking the Jonah story. There is another report of a man, Marshall Jenkins, surviving after being ingested by a huge sperm whale during a whale hunt in the South Seas during the fall of 1771. As the Boston Post-Boy newspaper reported on October 14, 1771, a whaling vessel from the port of Edgartown, Massachusetts, harpooned a sperm whale that turned and attacked its pursuers. First, the whale bit into one of the boats, breaking it into 2 parts. Then the whale swallowed the sailor, Marshall Jenkins, and submerged beneath the ocean's surface with him in its stomach. When the enormous whale finally rose again to the surface, the whale vomited Jenkins onto the floating wreckage of the broken harpoon boat, much bruised, but not seriously injured. The source Jeffrey cited for this quote is Ambrose John Wilson, from his article, The Sign of the Prophet Jonah and Its Modern Confirmations, published in the Princeton Theological Review 25 in 1927. The story, as Jeffrey relates it, grew a bit from Wilson's original. In Wilson's original article, Jenkins is never said to have been swallowed by the whale with him in its stomach, but instead the whale merely took Jenkins in her mouth and went down with him. In stretching the tale to make his apologetic point, Jeffrey also made it seem as though Jenkins had been gone a considerable amount of time, stating that when the enormous whale finally rose again to the surface. The Wilson article isn't nearly so dramatic, and merely states that immediately following Jenkins being taken in the whale's mouth, on returning to the surface, the whale had ejected him on the wreckage of the broken boat, much bruised, but not seriously injured. So how much time did Jenkins spend in the whale's mouth? A few minutes, perhaps? Clearly not long enough to drown. And Wilson's original article never claims Jenkins was ever swallowed by the creature. But can we even believe this story? Not only is Wilson relating a story in 1927 about a tale 146 years earlier from 1771, but Wilson also relates in his article the yarn about the previously discussed James Bartley, noting that the whole story was carefully investigated, and that the story was one worthy of belief. Furthermore, Wilson states that the details of the Bartley story have a vivid realism which seem to bear the stamp of truth upon them, even apart from the verification. If Wilson could swallow one phony tale about a man being consumed by a whale, living to tell about it in order to substantiate the Jonah story for a skeptical audience, he could swallow another. After all, Ambrose John Wilson wasn't simply a reporter, but was the Reverend Ambrose John Wilson, priest and headmaster of schools in Cape Colony, England and Australia. Wilson was writing with a vested interest in substantiating the Jonah story. In the end, there simply are no corroborative stories of human beings surviving an extended amount of time inside the digestive system of a large sea animal in the modern world for the biblical tale. There is a big difference between being swallowed whole by an animal, spending time in its digestive juices, living to tell about it, and simply being carried around in a whale's mouth for a few moments, or to travel around inside the belly of a whale or shark, only to be exhumed dead. When all is said and done, no known creature, living or extinct, is a reasonable candidate for the animal which swallowed Jonah. Faced with this fact, dejected apologists turn back to the Bible and note the verse in the book which states God prepared a great fish to swallow the prophet. As apologist Dr. John Morris admits, most importantly, the Bible says that the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Clearly, this event was miraculous and not a naturalistic phenomenon. Thus, we don't have to give it an explanation limited by modern experience or knowledge. Such an admission is reminiscent of the Talmud, a series of writings held central to Rabbinic Judaism, which contend the fish which swallowed Jonah had been created in the very beginning of the world in order to perform this function. The fish had a mouth and throat so large as to easily consume old Jonah. Once in its belly, according to the Talmud, he would have found lamps lighting up the fish's interior, or, as another tradition had it, a great pearl suspended in its entrails, enabling Jonah to see all that was in the sea outside. But with such an admission, the apologist abandons any hope of convincing any but those who already believe in the historicity of the fantastic tale that such an event really took place. If a miracle must be invoked to explain the otherwise inexplicable, why not step back and consider that the entire story may be one fictionalized to make an entirely different point than what appears on the surface? In our final episode, we will explore this option, that the tale of Jonah was never intended to be taken seriously as a recollection of historical events, and was, instead, satire of the highest order. The last laugh, then, would be on the apologists trying to argue for its historicity.
I'm a relative of the whale that swallowed Jonah. I'm the great-great-great-great-grandson of that fish, famous fish. And my grandfather always said that the preacher was poorly fed, 'cause the runaway prophet wasn't a tasty dish. Oh no, he wasn't a tasty dish. Now it all began in a storm when a ship was sinking, and they blamed it all on the guy who had thumbed a ride. So they said, let's throw him out, it'll plug this water spout. So they gave him the old heave-ho right over the side. Heave-ho, right over the starboard side. Then my grandpa spotted Jonah in the ocean, a-splashing around and thrashing enough for 10. And he opened his mouth a mite, and Jonah slid out of sight. But he'll never gobble down a preacher again. Oh no, he'll never gobble down a preacher again. For the next 3 days, that whale was a mighty sick creature. Oh, he moaned and he groaned and was sick as a whale could be. Poor fish. Then he gave old Jonah a break, and he cured his stomach ache, and cast him on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Yes, sirree, on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. So you see, when the Lord said, Jonah, go preach in Nineveh, go preach, Jonah said, no, Lord, that will never do, never do. So he ran the other way on the double into a whale of a lot of trouble. So will you if you run when there's work to be done. So will you if you run when there's work to be done. So will you if you run, run. If you run.